by making them come onto the stage.
That was produced recently, and let me pull it up so that I give you the exact right name, so that when you go to the Haymarket table, you know what book to look for. It's Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence, Imagination Towards Liberation. Uh, I'm excited to be bringing up three of the contributors to that book. and we're going to just engage in a conversation with them. Sometimes you'll be a part of it. There might be some interaction involved, but really it'll be a conversation between these three amazing human beings. The book itself will be available for sale out there and probably in here and everywhere. And if you'd love to get a copy, I've heard that these three amazing contributors are willing to sign your books. So little incentive. So I'd love to bring up first Mizue Aizeki, who is the co-editor of this book and also a contributor to this book, as well as the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Resistance Lab. Can we give him some love? Right on. Yeah, of course. No. I'm doing it as a lineup, you know. And coming up next, probably someone that doesn't require a whole lot of introduction, but someone I've been a huge fan of and read her work for a while now. Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who is the author of Race After Technology, right? Thank you. Of Imagination, a Manifesto. Really excited to have you up here. And then the last person coming up here, one of the most incredible organizers, I mean, literally the most incredible organizer I've ever come across in my life. Is that right? Jacinta González from Mi Gente. I'll turn it over to them now.
All right, we ready? Okay, thank you, Stephen and Media Justice. Thank you, Mi Gente and Jacinta, for creating this amazing space, not just this moment, but this movement space. And that's kind of what this book is about. It's about a movement trying to bring abolition towards liberation. Got to put it up here. Sorry. So everybody's tired. So please give yourself a round of applause for being here. Well, that's pretty cool. So we are also trying to have this as a conversation, but also engaging you all as well. And so we're going to spend a little time just talking about the book and the issues that are in the book, but also how it is that we need to activate our imagination towards the liberation that we're all fighting for. Yeah? Cool. Okay, sorry, I couldn't print this out, so I'm doing this. I'm not looking at Instagram. Oh, okay. All right, so I just wanted to welcome, just to tell you a little bit about the book and what brings me to Jacinta and Ruha here today, and also how this book was very foundational for founding the Surveillance Resistance Lab, which I did last year. But also, woo-hoo! So in terms of the book, I like to think in moments in time. So I remember the very first time I met Jacinta. It was at a conference where we were all fighting for detainer policies and, you know, so-called sanctuary policies. And it was a time where there was a lot of pressure in the movement to carve out people with criminal convictions, right? So Jacinta was taking the lead in New Orleans, a very hostile place, one would say, but also really organizing a very powerful detainer policy there, right? And I was then working at the Immigrant Defense Project. I know Paramita's here somewhere. Also doing the work in DC, and so many of you, I'm sure, as well. But this was just a really pivotal moment for us, really the ascendancy of you know, Obama's kind of criminalization of immigrants with convictions, police deportation pipeline and ICE raids. And so this was happening, and then we fought and fought during Obama times, and many of you all did. And then Jacinta came to New York in 2017 after Trump, and was kind of like, what the fuck, Palantir, right? And like literally, do you remember this? We were in that little room, and I was like, yeah, what the fuck, Palantir? And so then we were like, we got to get Paramita, and we got to write a report, right? Which became Who's Behind ICE. And the moment that it came out was really important, both because the big fight against the Amazon HQ2 in New York City, but also I think at a time where we were really trying to figure out, like, there's DHS, right? But there's also these corporations that are playing a really big role in fueling the deportation machine. And it was from that report and then the first Take Back Tech conference and No Tech for ICE that I think a lot of the momentum around this issue really grew. And so, yeah, what the fuck, Palantir? That was important. And so then it was, And it was interesting because Palantir, as you may know, is also active in the UK, right? And so it started a conversation across the pond, as people like to say, right? With organizers in the UK, No Tech for Tyrants, inspired by No Tech for ICE, just being like, how do we get Palantir out of our healthcare system, right? And also out of participating in policing of immigrants there. And so I was working in New York City, and part of the work I was doing was mapping ICE raids tactics across the city with Immigrant Defense Project. And someone contacted me, like a grad student at Cambridge, and was like, hey, you know those Link NYC kiosks? If people know New York City, right? There's these free Wi-Fi kiosks that were found to be like extracting all sorts of data from people and surveilling people with cameras. So Matt wanted to know, is ICE accessing this data? Right? And it just started a conversation around what we call smart city technologies, right? So like the way that cities adopt things like street lights or, financial services, like Docs was talking about benefit systems, right? All ways to make it efficient kind of in a neoliberal carceral city. How they almost always become tools of both increasing policing and corporate power. And so that happened, me talking to Matt. And then at the same time, we had been fighting. We had heard on Twitter that New York City was trying to digitize the municipal ID that we had fought for undocumented people at a time when it was the first year of the Trump presidency, right? And we found out that there's an RFP to put a digital chip on what was called the ID NYC that would have your subway tap and go, so it would track your transit. It would have all your health records. If you were unhoused, every homeless shelter stay, and then also a financial services function. And so we built up this big campaign in the city, and with a lot of, the mayoral administration really blocking every step of the way and trying to pit communities against each other, right? Unbanked communities against like immigrant communities. And this is where I met Ruha. Ruha was giving a talk at Riverside Church on your book at the time, What's the New Jim Code? And I, in my usual fashion, went up to Ruha after the talk and it was like, hey, we have this campaign against the IDNYC and we're getting a lot of pushback from the mayor. Can you write an op-ed and then maybe participate in what was supposed to be a toolkit, right? So this was supposed to be the toolkit for everybody because we were finding out all this stuff. Digital IDs led me to organizers in Kenya and India, and and we were learning about smart city technologies in San Diego and across the country, but also across the world, rather. But also, I think this idea, the centrality of digital ID systems as surveillance tools was really surfacing for me. And so Matt Colleen and I came together, we co-edited this volume, but really it's not my book, it's a book, it's all of our books. So there's a lot of people in this room who contributed. If you can just stand up, I see you, Ryan, Paramita, do you just mind? Come on. Is Hamid here? Stop LAPD spying? No, did he leave? Anyway, the point is, and Jacinta's in it, Ruha's in it. The idea was that we have essays that people can read by bringing together scholarship, right? It's 3,000 words, so hopefully you can read it, but also alongside organizing. So we have case studies and putting the EU and the United States in conversation as the two major colonial, imperial, racial capitalist powers who are both extremely invested in migration control and bordering. So that was the way the book came together and my intro, and now I'm going to turn it over to Ruha.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, good to see everyone. Thanks for hanging in till the last session. So, one of my soapboxes that I often stand on is this idea that we need to know what we're against, but also what we're for. So the worlds that we're tearing down, but also the ones that we're building and crafting together. And that involves creativity, it involves fun, it involves play, and it involves joy. And we don't have to apologize for being playful and joyful and creative and all of that. So we're going to do a little activity to enter into this conversation. So we're going to split the room in half, and I'm going to say this is the middle point here. So everyone on this side, your catchphrase when I point to you is be bold, okay? And I want you to say it like you're trying to shoot me like a rocket in the sky, all right? Now, everyone on this side, your catchphrase is get real. All right. And I want you to say it like an angsty teenager. Let's practice. Ready? Actually, you know what? There's a lot of extra people in these rows. So I'm going to say you guys get to be on this side too. You're the get real. All right. So ready? Okay. Now, when I point to you, get ready. Space travel. Free public transportation. Colonize Mars. Decolonize Earth. AI superintelligence. Fund schools and libraries. Build underground bunkers to survive the AI apocalypse. Build affordable housing for all. Expand high-tech borders drone by drone. Expand grassroots power to take back tech. Spend billions on weapons and war. End the genocide, ceasefire now. You get the picture. So you see how boldness is rationed while realism is mass produced. We are in many ways trapped inside the lopsided imagination of those who monopolize power and resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Now, these futurists, they let their own imaginations run wild when it comes to bending our material and our digital realities, but their visions grow limp when it comes to transforming our social reality so that everyone has a chance to live a good and meaningful life. So the challenge for all of us is not just being critical of those dominant imaginaries, but being creative and bold when it comes to our social vision. So with that foundation, let's transition into the conversation. I'm going to ask the first question, and I'm thinking back to 2015 when Aisha A. Siddiqui tweeted, "Every border implies the violence of its maintenance." So I'd love to ask you both, how does that idea resonate with your work on tech, surveillance, and migration control?
I'm going first. Okay. Well, first, I'm like, pinch me moment. Okay, got it. I think for us, you're talking about going down memory lane. Can you hear? Can you hear? Yep. Okay. So going down memory lane and actually seeing Mario and Leti over here in the first row, when we first were organizing in New Orleans against deportations and starting to we're part of the Not One More Deportation campaign. When we won that detainer policy, it was probably a couple of months later that we started to get calls from our neighbors, right? From folks in neighborhoods saying, well, ICE is actually coming into our neighborhood and they're fingerprinting people on the spot, right? They're going into our supermarkets, they're going into our neighborhoods, they're doing raids, they're stopping people, they're doing Bible studies, like they were real, had really, really lost it. And we started to do more and more research and started to understand that these were mobile fingerprinting devices that had been designed for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? This is the way that they were building files on people there, and now they were using it here. So when I think about the violence of detention centers, when I think of the violence of deportation and all of the work that the organizing has done to be able to stop those things, now understanding how tech and surveillance is being used to not only continue those practices, but expand them is really where it gets really scary. We're in a moment where so many folks are talking about detention numbers, but the Biden administration has massively expanded what they call an alternative to detention. What we know is really just incarceration, right? It's ankle shackles, it's continuing the same violence with the same companies that have those. We just put out a report with Just Futures Law that also shows that AI is now being used to make decisions about people's applications with USCIS, right? That Border Patrol is using it. And so we've also seen all of those technologies being used at the border. And so we start to make sure that we're making those connections between how ICE is operating inside of the country, and that's connected to the border, right? It's this idea of the border being a place that we have to militarize, that we have to invest in those types of resources. And I think sometimes people, especially in this moment, right? I think we're in a really critical moment as the election is coming up, right? And we're seeing the Democrats try to basically out-Republican the Republicans. And they're doing it really effectively. It's really scary to actually see, right? They're setting the agenda. You're talking about be bold. Trump and all his people keep making bolder and bolder demands. And what we see on the other side is people going right in the center to try to see if they can grab those folks while they're really ignoring the harms that they're conducting. And so I think, you know, in this moment, what we have to be doing is being watching and really clearly articulate the vision of what we want, because if not, they are transforming all of that maintenance of the border into paradigms that are reinforcing all of the violence that they're conducting in detention centers, all of the deportations that are happening, and doing it in the name of border security, right? That really is the dominant narrative that folks are using in this electoral cycle. But unfortunately, it's not just going to end in November. It actually becomes the new normal, and we're up against the next round.
Thanks, Jacinta. I think your mic is quiet. So I just, following on that point, you know, the thing about the biometrics collection in Afghanistan and Iraq, I just wanted to kind of just spend a little more time on that. And this idea, so the Department of Defense, when they were doing that, they called it identity dominance, right? Which is basically like, if we know exactly who you are, you can't hide and you can't win, right? And then you put that in conversation with ICE's first strategic plan called Operation Endgame, where they said explicitly, over the next 10 years, we want to identify every single person we could deport, right? So it's like identify, arrest, detain, and deport, but we have to be clear that we don't have the resources to get rid of everybody all at once. So we have to figure out how to stage it. And so I think some of the things in response to this prompt that, you know, as we try to talk about in the book, but as I always just try to talk about in life, like it's really important to think about this as a continuum, right, of settler colonialism, right? Nations require hierarchies of belonging, and the US very clearly had one, and those legacies continue to shape, right, kind of racialized hierarchies, class hierarchies, and also like national hierarchies of belonging, right? So that's part of what it is. The whole legal system is set up on it. Geographically, it's set up in that way. And these are things that we also have to dismantle and figure out. But then there's also very much the discursive, right? The ideas of kind of othering and that have been critical to the United States in terms of legitimating large-scale state violence, right? So the state is the only entity that's allowed to be violent, right? To like massively kill people in that way without any kind of punishment. And so I think that that's part of the history that's always really important to hold on to, is that it was, and it still is, incredibly violent, but that violence rests upon very strong ideas from eugenics, from, you know, slavery, from colonialism, of like that there is a legitimate practice of conquest and dispossession and now expulsion. But I think it's also really important to think about what is different now than then, because it is a continuum, but 9/11, right, did something. And it wasn't necessarily that it changed the ideologies. It didn't change all the laws, right? Because as we know, the 1996 laws and a few laws before that did a very good job of really setting the stage for the mass detention and deportation regime. But what 9/11 did then was both an unbelievable influx of funding, a reorientation of the government towards, you know, national security now is like everything, right? How do we solve climate crisis, right? We got to seal the borders. Like everything became about, we got to seal the borders. We got to deport people. We got to detain them. So I think part of what, you know, in thinking about tech in this moment is like, we are confronted by the ascendancy of like one of the oldest paradigms of depriving rights, right? Whether it's xenophobia, racism, or superiority and rights, right? I know I have to say this, Achille Mbembe's quote, right? Like sovereignty, it determines who has the right to live and who must die, right? And so we have even the Democrats scrambling to be like, no, we can do that too, right? And so that's not just here, everywhere, right? We've been following the rise of the far right in Europe. Like, you know, they're doing things like shipping people who are requesting asylum in the UK to Rwanda, right? And then these countries are making deals with these, you know, wealthy countries to basically say, this is a form of revenue for us, as we will detain people from other countries on your behalf, right? So the world is like, it's wicked in a way, and technology clearly plays a role in it, but it's the technology and this paradigm of what I call securitization, or the homeland security state, that we have to really think about and challenge. And, you know, one of the things, sorry, going back to this Operation Endgame, it's a good read because it's really like they didn't achieve their goal fully, but they tried really hard and they're pretty close, right? So they said, we want force multipliers everywhere. We want the postal worker, we want every, you know, domestic police, we want police, foreign police, we want tribal, you know, governments. Like, these are all force multipliers for ICE. And so back to this kind of point around identity dominance and what this means, you know, we gave a session yesterday on mobile driver's licenses. Like, these are really critical tools for state control and surveillance, but very much embedded in like the border surveillance industrial complex, right? The whole economy now is organized, right? Geopolitically, China, EU, India, it's all organized around surveillance technologies. And so this is, I don't remember what the question was, but I think this is the thing that makes me want to, you know what I'm saying? Okay.
Yes.
We know what you're saying. We know where you're going with this. And to pick up on a thread of what you're putting out, a lot of what's in the book, and actually both of your contributions touch on this, is the history, right? I mean, we went through our little organizing history here, just about how we got to this point. But there's decades old histories, there are centuries of history, of surveillance, of resistance to surveillance, of how these systems have taken up. And so just wanted to see if you guys could address a little bit how you talked about it in the book.
Yeah, I think when you initially approached me about contributing, it was a moment, and some of you may remember, when we were seeing those images of Haitian migrants trying to cross in from the US-Mexico border, and the kind of really old school repression, like people on horseback, like, you know, wielding whips. And so it kind of evoked this prior era of racial slavery and overseers and so on. And so I remember seeing those, two things came to mind. One was, you know, thinking back to a comment that Biden made in 1994. He was being interviewed by Charlie Rose, and he said, if Haiti quietly sunk into the Caribbean or rose 300 feet into the air, it wouldn't matter that much for our interests. So it was already a way of just discounting the life, the sovereignty, you know, of people who were now seeing repressed in this old school way. But the other thing that was happening was that his first day in office, while he put a stop to Trump's border wall, he also signed this, what was it, a U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 that had in it this call for more, quote, smart technologies at the border. And so for me, and you'll see in the foreword to the book, it's really important for us, going back to this continuum, that we not simply associate harm with that old, like, obvious forms of violence. We have to understand that violence can be very subtle, slow. It can be quantitative. It can be in the spreadsheets. It is encoded. And so it's part of kind of shining a light on the many forms of violence, so that we're not simply pushing our energy to stop the obvious when the insidious forms of violence persist. And then we think about the election coming up, that it's really a choice between evil and eviler, or obvious in your face repression and less obvious. And so I think one of the take homes then is that for all of us in this room, we're not simply, and we've heard this refrain beautifully over the course of all of the sessions, we're not simply resisting technology. We're resisting the kinds of social orders that create these technologies. So we can't simply call it a win because we get a policy passed that stops incarceration or that stops high-tech surveillance in one form. We have to also think about what are we actually doing to see new forms of social connection, relationships, institutions, cultural formations. And so we need all hands on deck, and we need both that pragmatic approach, like talking about policy, talking about legislation, but we also need that visionary world building approach that takes it upon itself to think about what kind of world do we want to live in that doesn't even see these would never even imagine, dream up these types of technologies, right? And so it's really an invitation for us to expand how we see harm, but then how we see the kinds of changes that we want to make going forward.
Thanks, Ruha. You should have spoke after me. I always say Ruha shines the light where I increase the darkness. So hold on to that. So your question about why is history important? So I think this idea of surveillance as being a colonial strategy, obviously. But like this idea of classification and control, for example, fingerprinting as it involved in the British colonization of India, like these are things that we have to understand and hold on to, because what we're confronted with is a normalization of categories, right? We think of like, oh, well, we all know there's the good immigrant or the bad immigrant. There's the innocent person and there's the criminal. There's the terrorist and then the whatever the alternative of that would be. But that to know that these are not objective states of being, right? They're obviously constructed, racialized categories. And the role of tech kind of in facilitating that, categorizing people, branding people, right, as they did to enslave people, has been very much a tool of the master or the powers in control since conquest and colonialism. But I think also just really then we always talk about how in our work, like, there's the material and then there's the discursive, right? And so if you look at the history of US immigration control, one of the things that I always like to talk about, because it's so hidden in US history, is the dominance of the Cold War, right, in the 20th century, of shaping all sorts of things, right? The war in Vietnam, right? The occupation of the Philippines, US occupation, the evolution of immigration law to target people who were subversives, communists, anarchists, labor organizers, Black nationalists. And if you look at the history, it's actually quite fascinating to see how so many of the provisions, like immigration lawyers, Paramita's not looking at me, but I'm talking to you. Immigration lawyers who will be like, these laws they make no sense. But a part of it's because these laws were constructed to exclude very clear categories of people as they evolved over time. So I think that part of what I think then that kind of merging into like the neoliberal moment, and this is not your question, but I wanted to just say it because does everyone know about Allende's happy machine or computer? I'm like obsessed with this story. Oh, sorry. Say it slower. I'm sorry. Okay, so Salvador Allende was the democratically elected president of Chile, right? I'm so tired. I sometimes feel like I'm losing my mind. Okay, was that right? And then had this idea of that we would have a happiness monitor in every home. So when they passed a policy like, free healthcare for all, what do you guys think? Ding. Do you know what I'm saying? Coca-Cola on every corner, like meh, like, right? Or some people ding, but like the idea of being like, we need to be the most responsive. And the story goes that when the US CIA backed the coup of Allende in a horrific massacre and grab of power, the sorry, why am I so tired? Pinochet, yeah, took over and turned that computer with the CIA into a way to connect policing databases across, South America, Central America, to suppress people opposing this kind of dictatorial rule. So that's the kind of thing that I talked to a young person yesterday. I was like, if there's a piece of history I think you should study, it's really the ascendancy of neoliberalism. See, this was at a party, okay? This is my party trick. Yeah, see what I mean? And I was like, then go talk to Ruha. But yeah, this is why history is important, right? Because we really have to understand really deeply where there were possibilities, how they were taken away in order to win them back. Sorry.
Mizue is my favorite dark cloud of blue. Favorite dark cloud of blue.
Oh, it's my question. Sorry. Okay. So we're going to have one more question here that I'm going to ask Ruha and Jacinta, and it's going to be something that tries to turn the dark cloud into sunshine. Sorry, give me a second. Okay, so Ruha, in your newest book, Imagination, a Manifesto, you challenge us to stretch our radical imagination towards a world where all people can thrive, in contrast to, for example, the eugenic imagination that's codified in US and European immigration policies and practices. Sorry. Oh, for them. I'm sorry. Jacinta, your work and No Tech for ICE has been foundational. And for us, but being here, but also I think in terms of the field, really seeing both kind of the power that we have to fight back against and how we can do it with beauty and joy. So I think I would love for you both to reflect on what comes to mind for you as we close out this conversation. On what it means when you say, here, be visionary. We're going to start with you.
Ooh, easy question. It was interesting because a lot of this was coming up yesterday when we were in our corporate targeting campaign workshop. So many times with campaigns, sometimes there'll be like these visionary, ideas, but no base, right? Or then you'll have folks that are actually trying to do something, but they're talking about just one little policy, and that's the victory, and that's their little neck of the woods, right? I think to me, the visionary part is both where we're trying to go, but how we're trying to get there, right? How are we trying to organize to actually build the power to make that real? As opposed to just kind of taking opportunities and hits and moments and how many likes do you have on Instagram and is this going to go viral on Twitter or not, right? How are you actually building up rooms like this, right? That can actually collectively dream up whatever that vision is going to be, because it's not one person's vision. It's not one wild dream. It's actually a practice that we have day in, day out of how we organize. And this came up a lot for us when we did the report, the Who's Behind ICE report. Folks were like, oh, you can't do corporate campaigns against those companies, right? You got to choose the easy companies. The companies that like try to pretend to have a social social ethics, whatever they call it, right? Try to pretend to have some sort of value. You don't take the evil ones. And an organizer in Arizona once said, and I will always remember this, every party needs a piñata. You need someone to go beat up on, right? To actually mobilize people, to get the excitement. It's fun to like go and grab the piñata, right? So when you grab Palantir piñatas and take them to their offices when they're moving to Colorado and throw them an unwelcome party, it's like you get two piñatas, right? You get double. But it's how do you actually give people an opportunity to not only see the whole system, but how do I plug in? Where can I participate? There's never going to be one strategy, y'all. Like there's not going to be this one vision. And if we just do this for the next 30 years, we're going to get to liberation. It's going to take students organizing on campus against recruitment. It's going to take investors trying to get their money into different places. It's going to take organizers taking the streets, fighting for local government, fighting to be able to dictate what our neighborhoods should look like and feel like and be like. And so to me, it is that the vision part comes from the practice part. It does come about how do you actually organize? How are you bringing more people into the room? How are you not saying, well, X, Y, or Z person can't come in because they don't know the terms yet? Bring them in. How are we welcoming them in? How are we making these things accessible? Sometimes we're trying to explain so many concepts in like the first 5 minutes that if they don't get it, you know, we discard people. We actually throw folks out of our movements. And so how do we actually bring more people into the room, to me, is part of the vision, is part of the organizing, is part of the strength. And I do think it's also, you know, we were talking yesterday about being mamas and like thinking about future generations. How are we creating spaces for them to come in, right? And how are we actually thinking about what kind of world we're helping to co-create with them, with those values, with those principles, with all of that? And, you know, I think, again, the hope with all of this is that relationships matter. Going back to Leti and Mario over here, we met in 2008. Now they're running an organization in Louisiana after being members of the Congreso de Jornaleros. Now they have Familias Unidas. Very big part of all this history. But it's because of those relationships, right? It doesn't matter what organization you're from. It doesn't matter what your like 10-year plan is. It actually matters how we build with each other. And to me, that's part of the vision.
Yes. And so when I think of that idea of being visionary, you know, we think vision forward, but it all, for me, also starts with how we look backwards, thinking about our historical imagination. And, you know, I'm sick and tired of talking about AI, unless we're talking about another kind of AI, which is ancestral intelligence. We talk about, you know, the cultural knowledges, the collective wisdom that we have to draw on, you know, the resources that we have that are latent. And so how do we sort of grow that and let that also guide our work? And a lot of times I think even if our goals are different than the opposition, we often continue to replicate the same ways of doing things to achieve those goals. And one example, you know, that just hits close to home for me is, you know, just thinking about the role of elitism and expertise and stardom in movements. We don't need more stars. We need a constellation, right? We need to think about all of us and all of the things that we bring to the table. So that's just one example of many where we really need to think about the values that are guiding our work. The other thing that I think about in terms of be visionary is literally bees. Being visionary. You know, the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things my family did was, you know, start beekeeping. So I've become a bee nerd, learning everything I can about bees and their own kind of sociality. And one of the many lessons that I write about at the end of Imagination is the fact that the bees that are in my backyard right now that are doing all the work, buzzing around, you know, filling the hives with honey, they're not going to, and they're doing that to ensure that the hives are full in the winter, right? But they're not going to live that long. So they're doing all this work, creating the sustenance, the sweetness to ensure that the next generation of bees in my backyard are able to survive the winter. So for many of us, we're not necessarily going to experience the full fruit of the labor that we're engaged in now. But as, you know, Jacinta and Mizue have alluded, this is part of our intergenerational solidarity. What we owe not just our kids, but future generations. And so, you know, we have that adage that we often say, you know, I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. And so the question is, are we our descendants' wildest dreams? Are we doing the work? Are we living the lives? Are we creating the sweetness and the stings? Pop, pop. It goes, we need both. That our descendants will actually feel like, oh, you know, we left them with the reserve, the resources that they need now to be able to flourish. And so that's what I think of. And really nerdy that we all need to be visionary.
Thank you all. I think we did good on time. All right. Do you want to say something closing?
Closing or? I mean, closing, I just want to say to both of these amazing humans, the work that's in this book also reflects just the intentionality of principles and action together, right? And I hope that folks are able to sort of see that, because I think, you know, we can now tell a lot of stories, but there's been a lot of fights to make sure that, for example, these conversations around folks with criminal record not being, you know, tossed to the sides, when we're talking about actually talking about race right? When we're talking about the systems around immigration and border, they've been so important. And so just wanted to thank both of y'all so much for your work, for your trajectory, and for being here today. So a big round of applause for both of them, please.
Hold on.
Ruha's other books are here. And this book is here. And we're going to, I'll do a couple of am I doing the announcements? We're going to the
I
announcement?
can do it because y'all are going to take a picture together.
Oh, we're
I
gonna take a
believe.
picture.
Right, Kike?
Okay, we're doing a picture?
You're doing a picture of them, right? Can we give them a
let's do
round of applause for all three? The book is Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence. It'll be available for y'all to pick up, and they'll be available to sign it. So there's some incentive. Did y'all have bees, piñatas, and dark clouds on your bingo card for this conversation? It was an amazing conversation. We got one more shot. While they're doing that, we're going to need the crowd's participation for this next part. There's two things you all need to do. We need to set up for the actual Oregon Book Fair in this space. So we're actually going to invite you to go outside. We're going to take a big group shot together. So we'd love to invite you to go outside. But as you do that, if you can also grab any cups, plates, and just get rid of them, because we're going to be using the tables actually to set up some of the organizational and book stuff.